What happened to the American pickups that built the foundation of the modern truck? Welcome back to Forgotten Cars. Today, we're looking at 7 American pickups that almost everyone has forgotten. They weren't all rare, and they weren't all failures, but somehow, history left them behind. Why does nobody remember these trucks today? Subscribe, leave a like, and tell me in the comments which one you remember. Let's get started. 1935 Ford Model 50 pickup. The V8 pickup almost everyone forgot. Why did one of the earliest V8 pickups become almost invisible today? When you hear the words Ford V8, you probably think of something powerful, something loud, something fast, something that changed American cars forever. But here's the part that surprised me. The famous Ford V8 wasn't only being put into sleek passenger cars. Ford was also putting that revolutionary V8 into pickup trucks. And one of the early examples was the 1935 Model 50 Ford. Today, it can be surprisingly easy to look at one and think, just another old Ford truck. But that's completely missing the story. Because in 1935, this wasn't just another pickup. It represented a major change in what an American work truck could be. Think about what a pickup was supposed to be in the early 1930s. Simple, slow, rugged, built primarily to work. You didn't necessarily expect a pickup to have serious performance. Then Ford introduced the flathead V8 into the equation. Suddenly, a truck could have the kind of engine that had made Ford's passenger cars famous. And that changed the conversation. Now imagine you're a farmer or small business owner in 1935. You need a truck. You want something dependable enough to haul equipment and supplies, but you also don't want to crawl along the road. Then you see a Ford pickup with a V8 under the hood. That must have been a completely different experience. Because this wasn't some giant heavy-duty machine. It was a relatively compact pickup, with an engine that gave it a completely different personality. And that's what makes the Model 50 so interesting. It arrived at a time when America was becoming increasingly obsessed with power. The automobile was no longer just about getting from one place to another. Americans wanted more speed, more performance, more capability. Ford understood that, and the V8 became one of the company's greatest weapons. But there's an irony here. The more successful the V8 became, the easier it became to forget the early trucks that helped establish its reputation. Today, people remember the flathead V8. They remember famous Ford cars. They remember hot rods. They remember custom-built classics. But the original working pickups that carried these engines are much less talked about, and the Model 50 is one of them. That's what makes this truck perfect for a forgotten car story. Because the question isn't whether it was important, it was. The question is, why don't more people remember it? Part of the answer is simple. It was a working vehicle, and working vehicles have a brutal life. A 1935 pickup wasn't usually bought by someone planning to preserve it for 90 years. It was bought to work. It carried lumber, tools, farm equipment, supplies, whatever its owner needed. It was driven through dirt, through mud, through winter. It was loaded and unloaded constantly, and when something broke, it was repaired, sometimes properly, sometimes creatively. And eventually, when the truck became too old to justify repairing, many were simply discarded. That's one of the reasons early pickups are so fascinating today. The vehicles that survived weren't necessarily the most beautiful. They were the ones that somehow escaped being destroyed. And the Model 50 had another disadvantage. It was born in the middle of the Great Depression. America wasn't exactly overflowing with people who could afford to preserve automobiles. Every dollar mattered. A truck wasn't a luxury, it was an investment. If it could still work, you kept using it. If it couldn't, you found another truck. That economic reality explains why so many early American pickups disappeared. They were valuable because they were useful, but that same usefulness eventually destroyed them. And then something else happened. America moved on. The automotive industry changed rapidly. New designs appeared, new engines, new body styles, new generations of trucks.
And suddenly, the 1935 Ford looked old, then very old, then ancient. By the time collectors began seriously appreciating early pickups, enormous numbers of them had already vanished. But imagine finding one today, an old Ford sitting in a barn, faded paint, cracked tires, maybe the body covered in decades of dust. At first glance, it looks like another forgotten pre-war truck. Then you realize what you're looking at, a 1935 Ford Model 50, one of Ford's early V8-powered pickups. And suddenly, that old truck doesn't look ordinary anymore. You're looking at a vehicle from a period when Ford was changing the expectations of American transportation. And there's something else that makes the Model 50 special. The V8 wasn't just about speed. For a truck, it also meant effortless power compared to earlier designs. A pickup could carry its load and still have enough engine to move with confidence. That mattered, because America was becoming more connected, roads were improving, businesses were expanding. Farmers needed to move products farther, small companies needed dependable transportation. A more powerful pickup could do more work in less time. So the V8 wasn't simply a performance gimmick, it was part of the transformation of the American work vehicle. And Ford was putting that technology into the hands of ordinary customers. That's a huge part of the story. The Model 50 wasn't some exotic machine built for millionaires. It was a working Ford. And that meant the V8 was moving from something revolutionary towards something ordinary. That's how technology becomes part of everyday life. First, it's incredible. Then it's desirable. Then it becomes normal. And eventually, people forget how revolutionary it once was. That's exactly what happened with early Ford V8 pickups. The V8 became so deeply connected with American automotive culture that we forget there was a time when putting one into a pickup was a major statement. The Model 50 existed during that transition, and that's why I think it deserves more attention. Because if you only look at the truck, you might see an old Ford. But if you look at the moment in history, you see something much bigger. You see Ford taking one of its most important engine innovations and putting it into a vehicle designed for ordinary American working people. That's a powerful combination. But the Model 50 wasn't destined to become as famous as later Ford pickups. The F-Series would eventually dominate the American truck market. Later generations would become icons. Collectors would chase them, movies would feature them, and the early Model 50 would slowly become a footnote. That's the strange irony. The trucks that helped establish Ford's reputation as a builder of powerful pickups are now overshadowed by the trucks that came later. So when you see a 1935 Model 50 today, don't just see an old pickup. See a moment in history when Ford was changing the rules. A time when a work truck didn't have to be slow. A time when the V8 was still something extraordinary. And a time when American pickup trucks were beginning to evolve into the powerful machines we recognize today. Because the real mystery isn't, why did Ford put a V8 in a pickup? The real mystery is, how did one of the earliest V8 pickups become so easy for history to overlook? Maybe the answer is that it arrived too early. Maybe it's because most of them were worked to death. Or maybe it's simply because Ford eventually built so many famous pickups that the pioneers disappeared behind the legends. Whatever the reason, the surviving Model 50s are incredibly important. They're reminders of a time when the American pickup was changing forever. And perhaps that's the best way to look at this truck. It wasn't just an old Ford. It was one of the early steps toward the American V8 pickup culture that would eventually become legendary.
2. 1937 Chevrolet half-ton pickup. The beautiful Chevy America forgot. Why did this beautiful pre-war Chevy disappear from America's memory? When you look at a 1937 Chevrolet half-ton pickup today, the first thing that stands out isn't how tough it looks, it's how beautiful it is. And that's what makes this truck so interesting. Because Chevrolet was doing something very important in 1937. The company was taking the traditional American work truck and trying to make it look like something people would actually want to drive. Before this period, a pickup was mostly seen for what it was, a tool. You bought one because you needed to carry something. You needed to work. You needed to haul equipment. Nobody expected a truck to look elegant. Then Chevrolet changed the formula. The 1937 redesign brought a smoother, more modern appearance. The cab looked more refined. The proportions became cleaner. And suddenly, the pickup looked less like a crude commercial vehicle and more like a proper automobile. That may sound normal today, but in the late 1930s, this was a meaningful change. America was entering a new era of automotive design. Cars were becoming smoother. Bodies were becoming more aerodynamic. Fenders were being integrated more carefully. Manufacturers were realizing something important. People didn't just want useful vehicles anymore. They wanted vehicles that looked good, and Chevrolet understood that. The 1937 half-ton was part of that transformation. But here's the strange part. Today, if you ask someone to name a classic Chevrolet pickup, they probably won't mention this one. They'll think of the famous post-war trucks, the Cameo, the Task Force series, the early CK trucks, later generations, the iconic Chevrolets that became deeply embedded in American car culture. The 1937 truck? For many people, it's almost invisible. And that's a shame, because this was one of the trucks that helped establish the visual direction Chevrolet would follow for decades. Imagine walking into a Chevrolet dealership in 1937. The country was still dealing with the aftermath of the Great Depression. Money was tight. People weren't buying vehicles just for fun. If you were buying a pickup, it needed to earn its keep. Yet Chevrolet was presenting you with something that looked surprisingly sophisticated. It wasn't simply, here's your work truck. It was closer to, here's your work truck and we're going to make it look good. That was an important psychological shift, because the more attractive a truck became, the easier it was to imagine using it for more than work. A farmer could use it during the week, a businessman could drive it around town, a small shop owner could use it for deliveries. And suddenly, the pickup started becoming part of everyday life. That's one of the reasons the 1937 design matters. It helped push the pickup toward becoming something more than a specialized commercial machine. But then history became brutal, because this beautiful Chevrolet arrived at exactly the wrong moment. The world was changing, and within only a few years, America would enter World War II. Factories would change priorities, civilian vehicle production would be restricted, materials would become difficult to obtain, and the automotive industry would be transformed. So the 1937 to 1940 era became a strange little window. Manufacturers were developing new designs, but history was about to interrupt everything. And that means many of these trucks didn't get the long, normal life that later pickups enjoyed. They were working vehicles during an incredibly difficult period, and just like the Ford Model 50, many were used until they couldn't be used anymore. That's one of the biggest reasons pre-war pickups are so rare today. A truck from 1937 had to survive almost a century. Think about everything that could happen during that time. Rust, accidents, mechanical failure, modifications, neglect, scrapping, and perhaps most importantly, being considered worthless. For decades, an old 1937 pickup wasn't necessarily seen as a collectible. It was simply an old truck. If the engine failed, you might replace it. If the body rusted, you might cut it apart. If you needed parts, you might use another old truck. Nobody knew that decades later, collectors would be searching for original examples. That's how automotive history disappears. Not because nobody cared about the vehicles when they were new, but because nobody realized they would eventually become important. And the Chevrolet half-ton has another problem. It sits in the shadow of everything Chevrolet built afterward. That's a huge disadvantage. Later Chevrolet trucks became cultural icons. They were bigger, more powerful, more recognizable. They appeared in movies. They became part of American nostalgia. They became restoration projects.
And eventually, they almost completely buried the earlier trucks in people's memories. It's like being the first chapter of a great story, only for everyone to remember chapter 10. But if you look closely at the 1937 half-ton, you can see the beginning of that story. The smoother body, the more integrated design, the stronger visual connection between a truck and a passenger car. It's Chevrolet saying, a work truck doesn't have to look ugly. And that's a surprisingly important idea. Because once manufacturers realized people cared about how their pickups looked, the entire truck market began changing. Chrome would come, two-tone paint, more comfortable cabins, larger engines, better interiors. Eventually, pickups would become lifestyle vehicles. But that transformation didn't happen overnight. It started with designs like this. And that's why I think the 1937 Chevrolet deserves more attention. It's easy to look at it and see an old pre-war truck. But imagine seeing it in 1937. After years of conservative truck design, this must have looked remarkably modern. The world was still full of boxy utility vehicles. Then Chevrolet gave its pickup a much more sophisticated personality. And there was something else happening under the surface. Chevrolet was competing directly with Ford, and Ford had a huge advantage because of its famous V8. Chevrolet needed its own reasons for customers to choose it. Design was one of them. The Chevy didn't necessarily need to be the most powerful truck. It needed to feel modern. It needed to look attractive. It needed to convince buyers that Chevrolet understood where the future was going. The 1937 half-ton was part of that transformation. But here's the irony. The truck succeeded, but the memory didn't. Chevrolet survived, the pickup line survived, the company became one of the dominant names in American trucks. But the individual vehicles that helped build that success gradually disappeared. And today, the 1937 half-ton is often overshadowed by the trucks that came after it. So that's why finding one now would be incredible. Imagine seeing one sitting inside an old barn, dust covering the hood, the original grille still intact. Maybe the paint is almost completely gone, but the shape is still there. And suddenly, you realize this isn't just some old Chevrolet. This is a truck from a completely different America. A truck built before the war, before the interstate highway system, before muscle cars, before modern pickups became enormous. A truck from a time when the American automotive industry was still figuring out what a pickup could become. And suddenly, that old Chevy looks completely different. It becomes a time capsule, a piece of pre-war America. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Chevrolet remembered how to build the future, but America almost forgot the truck that helped get it there. The funny thing is, the truck didn't need to be revolutionary to matter. It simply needed to move the design forward, and that's exactly what it did. So when you see a 1937 Chevrolet half-ton today, don't just see an old Chevy. Look at the shape, look at the cab, look at the styling, and remember what you're actually looking at. One of the early American pickups that helped turn the work truck into something people could admire. A beautiful truck from an era that almost disappeared. And perhaps that's the real tragedy. Chevrolet remembered how to build the future, but America almost forgot the truck that helped get it there.
3. 1940 GMC half-ton pickup. The beautiful GMC built just before everything changed. How did GMC create such a stylish pickup just before the world changed forever? When you look at the 1940 GMC half-ton pickup, it's hard to believe this truck was built just before one of the biggest disruptions in automotive history. Because at first glance, it doesn't look like a machine from the beginning of a new decade. It looks surprisingly modern. The rounded cab, the flowing fenders, the smooth body lines, the proportions, everything about it suggests that GMC was moving away from the old idea of a pickup as nothing more than a basic work machine. And that's what makes this truck so fascinating, because in 1940, GMC was quietly showing what the next generation of American pickups could look like. But then, the world changed, and within only a few years, this beautiful civilian truck would become part of a completely different America. To understand why the 1940 GMC matters, you have to imagine what American pickups looked like only a few years earlier. They were generally much more upright, more mechanical looking, separate fenders, tall grills, simple cabins. The message was obvious: this is a tool. Then the designers started changing everything. Bodies became smoother, fenders flowed into the overall shape, cabs became more rounded, and manufacturers began borrowing ideas from passenger cars. The pickup was slowly becoming more sophisticated. GMC was right in the middle of that transformation, and the 1940 half-ton was one of the clearest examples. It didn't look like a tractor with a cargo box anymore. It looked like an actual automobile that just happened to have a pickup bed. That distinction may seem small today, but at the time, it was a major shift because the American buyer was changing too. People wanted useful vehicles, but they also wanted attractive vehicles. A truck could be practical and still have style, and GMC understood that. Imagine seeing this truck in 1940. You're walking down the street and a GMC pickup passes by. The body is rounded, the fenders curve smoothly, the cab looks much more comfortable than the old truck designs, and the entire vehicle has a sense of motion even when it's standing still. For a working vehicle, that's impressive. But then comes the part that makes the story almost tragic. 1940 was right before everything changed. Europe was already at war, America was moving closer and closer to involvement, and the automotive industry was about to be transformed. Factories that had been building cars and trucks would soon be producing military equipment. Materials would become restricted, civilian production would be disrupted, and the normal evolution of American automobiles would effectively be put on hold. So the 1940 GMC represents something unusual. It's a glimpse of what the American pickup was becoming right before history slammed the brakes on the entire industry. Think about that. GMC was refining its civilian truck design. Engineers were improving shapes, designers were making trucks more attractive, manufacturers were competing to create the next generation of vehicles. And then, suddenly, the priorities changed. The country needed war machines, not stylish pickups, not chrome, not new consumer designs. Everything had to serve a much larger purpose. And that means the 1940 GMC belongs to a very special moment. It's part of the last chapter of America's pre-war pickup era. After that, the world would be different, and so would the trucks. But there's another reason this GMC is so easy to overlook today: Chevrolet. GMC and Chevrolet were closely connected within General Motors, and over time, Chevrolet became the much more recognizable consumer truck name. When most people think about classic GM pickups, they think Chevrolet. GMC certainly has its own history and loyal following, but Chevrolet became the dominant memory. And that created a problem for earlier GMC trucks. The 1940 half-ton can be historically important and still be overshadowed by its Chevrolet relatives. It's almost as if GMC's own success as part of General Motors made some of its history harder to distinguish. The average person sees an old GM truck and immediately thinks Chevy, but then they look closer. The badge says GMC, and suddenly the story becomes much more interesting, because this isn't just another pre-war pickup. It's a GMC from a moment when the company was rapidly modernizing its light truck design, and the styling tells the story. Look at the fenders. They don't look like separate pieces stuck onto a box. They flow into the overall body. Look at the cab. It's rounded instead of brutally upright. Look at the overall proportions. Everything feels more integrated. This is the beginning of the pickup becoming a designed object, not just an engineered one. And that would have enormous consequences. Because once buyers started caring about how a truck looked, manufacturers had to start caring too. The competition became more than payload capacity. Now it was about appearance, comfort, brand identity, and eventually, lifestyle.
But the 1940 GMC came before that transformation was complete. It was still unmistakably a work truck, still designed to carry cargo, still meant to be useful, but it had something earlier pickups often lacked: personality. And perhaps that's why I find it so fascinating. It represents the exact moment when the American pickup was beginning to become something more. Not quite a family vehicle, not yet a lifestyle machine, but no longer just a piece of farm equipment. Something in between. And then, the war interrupted the story. Imagine being a GMC engineer in 1940. You just helped create a beautiful new truck. You think about the next model, the next design, the next improvement, and suddenly, the entire company has to focus on something else. The civilian automotive future has been put on hold. That's how quickly history can change the direction of an industry. And that's why surviving examples of these trucks are so fascinating today. Every one of them is a reminder of the world that existed just before the war transformed America. Think about what a 1940 GMC would have seen. A country recovering from the Depression, a rapidly changing automotive industry, new roads, new technology, and then World War II. A truck like this could have been used by a farmer, a contractor, a small business owner, or a local delivery company. It could have spent years working, and if it survived long enough, it eventually became a piece of history. But most didn't. Again, that's the brutal life of an old work truck. Nobody preserved them because they were beautiful. They preserved them because they were useful. And once they stopped being useful, many were discarded. That is why a surviving 1940 GMC is so special. It's not simply an old pickup. It's evidence that this particular moment existed. A moment when GMC was pushing American truck design forward just before the entire world changed. And there's something almost haunting about that, because when you look at the truck today, you know what happened next. And perhaps one of the last beautiful GMCs built before America entered a completely different world.
4. 1949 Ford F1 pickup, the truck that started it all. Why does almost everyone remember the F100, but forget the truck that started it all? When people hear Ford F-Series, they usually think of the F100, or perhaps the modern F-150. But before those legendary trucks, there was the 1949 Ford F1. And this truck deserves far more attention than it gets. Because the F1 wasn't simply another Ford pickup. It was the beginning of the F-Series story. After World War II, America was changing rapidly. Factories were returning to civilian production, people were buying cars again, businesses were expanding, and demand for practical trucks was exploding. Ford realized that its old pre-war truck designs were no longer enough. The company needed something completely new. So, in 1948, Ford introduced a brand new line of trucks, the F-Series. And the F1 was the light-duty pickup at the heart of it. What made it different? For starters, Ford wasn't simply taking a passenger car and attaching a cargo bed. The new truck was designed specifically as a truck. But Ford also wanted it to be more comfortable and easier to live with. The cab was wider. The windshield was larger. The interior was more practical. The suspension was improved. And the overall design looked much more modern than the trucks Ford had built before the war. For someone stepping out of a 1930s pickup, the F1 must have felt like a completely different machine. It wasn't just a work tool anymore. It was becoming something you could actually spend hours inside. And that was important, because the post-war American pickup market was about to explode. Farmers needed trucks. Construction companies needed trucks. Small businesses needed trucks. Delivery companies needed trucks. And ordinary families were increasingly discovering that a pickup could be useful for everyday life. Ford was ready. The F1 arrived at exactly the right moment. And that's why the story becomes so strange. Because this truck became the foundation of one of the most successful vehicle families in history. Yet many people barely remember it. Ask someone to name a classic Ford pickup. They'll probably say F100. Maybe an F-150. Maybe a 1950s Ford style side. But the F1? Often nothing. And that's almost unfair, because without the F1, there would be no F-100 story in the first place. The F1 established the basic idea that would define Ford's F-Series for generations. A dependable truck that could work hard while still being comfortable enough for everyday driving. And Ford was very deliberate about that. The post-war buyer was different from the buyer of the 1930s. America was entering an economic boom. Suburbs were expanding, roads were improving, people were traveling more, and trucks were no longer confined to farms and industrial businesses. The pickup was becoming part of everyday American life. Ford understood this transformation. The F1 was built for work, but it was designed with the driver in mind. That's one of the biggest reasons it mattered. The old idea of the pickup was, how much can it carry? The new idea was becoming, how much can it carry and how comfortable can we make it? That sounds obvious today, but in 1949 it was a major shift. And Ford wasn't alone. Chevrolet was developing its own post-war trucks. GMC was competing. Dodge and International were fighting for buyers. The American pickup market was becoming extremely competitive. Every manufacturer wanted to convince customers that its truck was tougher, smarter, more modern, or simply better. Ford had a huge advantage, though. It had the F-Series name, and that name would eventually become enormous. But the F1 was still at the beginning of that journey. It didn't have the cultural status of the later trucks. It wasn't yet an icon. It was simply a new Ford pickup. And that's probably one reason history has overlooked it. We tend to remember the vehicles that became legends, not necessarily the vehicles that started the legend. Think about the F-Series today. It's one of the most recognizable names in the American automotive world. But every legendary family has a beginning, and the F1 was that beginning. There's something fascinating about seeing one today. The shape is unmistakably old. The proportions are simple. The styling is unmistakably late 1940s. But underneath that appearance is an idea that would dominate the American truck market for decades. Ford wasn't trying to create a collectible. It was trying to create the future of its truck business. And it succeeded. The F-Series would evolve again and again. The F1 would eventually give way to later models. Then came the F100. Then the F150. Then generations of increasingly powerful and sophisticated pickups. But the basic philosophy remained remarkably consistent. Build a truck people can work with every day. That's the legacy of the F1. And there's another reason these early trucks are so interesting. They arrived in the immediate aftermath of World War II. That means they represent a completely different America. A country that had just emerged from years of rationing and wartime production. People were ready for something new. They wanted modern vehicles. They wanted economic growth. They wanted to build businesses. They wanted houses. They wanted families. And the pickup truck became one of the tools of that transformation. The F1 was right there in the middle of it. A farmer could use it to haul equipment. A contractor could carry materials. A business owner could make deliveries. And an ordinary family could use it for almost anything. That versatility helped create the modern American pickup culture. But there's an ironic side to the story. The more successful the F-Series became, the easier it was to forget where it started. The later F100s became much more famous. Their styling became more distinctive. Their engines became more powerful. Their connection to American nostalgia became stronger. Classic truck collectors began chasing them. Movies and television helped them make them recognizable. And slowly, the F1 became the forgotten ancestor. But that's exactly why I think it belongs in this story.
Because sometimes the most important vehicle isn't the one that became famous. It's the one that made the famous vehicle possible. Imagine finding a perfectly preserved 1949 F1 today. Original paint, original grille, original interior, maybe even the old Ford badge still sitting proudly on the front. At first, someone might say, it's just an old Ford pickup. But then you remember what you're actually looking at. You're looking at the truck that launched the F-Series, the family that would eventually become one of the most important pickup lines in American history. That's not just an old truck. That's a beginning. And beginnings are often forgotten. We remember the champions. We remember the best-selling generations. We remember the models that became cultural icons. But the first one? Sometimes it gets lost. That's exactly what happened to the F1. And perhaps that's the real mystery. Why does almost everyone remember the F100 but forget the truck that started it all? Because the F100 became a legend. The F1 became its foundation. And foundations are rarely the part people talk about. But without that foundation, there would be no F100, no F150, no decades-long F-Series legacy. So the next time you see a classic Ford pickup, look at the badge. And remember that before Ford became America's pickup giant, there was one truck that started the journey. The 1949 F1 Ford. The first chapter of a story that would eventually become legendary.
5. 1950 Chevrolet 3100 pickup, the simple truck that changed everything. How did this simple work truck become one of America's most influential pickup designs? At first glance, the 1950 Chevrolet 3100 doesn't look like the kind of vehicle that should become legendary. It's simple. It's practical. There's nothing about it that screams performance or luxury. But look at it closely, and you start to understand why this truck became so important. Because the 1950 Chevrolet 3100 wasn't trying to be a sports car. It wasn't trying to be a luxury vehicle. It was trying to become something much more useful, the perfect everyday American pickup. And Chevrolet came surprisingly close. After World War II, America was entering a completely different era. The war was over, factories were returning to civilian production, people were buying new vehicles again, businesses were expanding, families were moving into the suburbs, and there was enormous demand for practical transportation. The pickup truck was perfectly positioned for this new America. But buyers were changing. They didn't necessarily want the crude work trucks of the past. They wanted something that could work hard, but also be comfortable enough to drive every day. Chevrolet's answer was the advanced design truck, and the 3100 was one of its most important versions. The first thing you notice is the shape. The cab is rounded, the front end is clean, the headlights are integrated into the fenders. The body has a much more unified appearance than earlier trucks. It doesn't look like someone took a car and simply attached a cargo box. It looks like a vehicle that was designed as a complete package. And that was a big deal, because Chevrolet was helping redefine what an American pickup could be. Before this period, a truck was primarily a commercial tool. After this period, it was increasingly becoming something else, something people could use for work and still be proud to drive home. Imagine walking into a Chevrolet dealership around 1950. America is booming, the streets are filling with new cars, the post-war economy is growing, and sitting there is a brand new 3100. Compared with many older trucks, it must have looked incredibly modern. The rounded cab, the wide windshield, the smooth fenders, the bold Chevrolet grille, the overall proportions, everything feels more intentional, more civilized. This wasn't just a machine designed to survive hard work. It was a machine designed to make hard work a little easier. And that's where Chevrolet understood something important. A pickup doesn't have to look miserable to be useful. That idea would become incredibly powerful, because once buyers realized they could have a truck that worked hard and looked good, there was no going back. And the competition noticed. Ford was building the F-Series, GMC was developing its own trucks, International was fighting for commercial buyers, Dodge was competing. The American pickup market was becoming a battlefield. Every company wanted to create the truck that workers trusted, but they also wanted to create the truck that ordinary people wanted to own. Chevrolet's advanced design trucks became a major part of that transformation, and the 3100 was right in the middle of it. But here's the strange part. The 3100 became famous, yet the reason for its importance is sometimes forgotten. People remember the look, they remember the rounded body, they remember the classic Chevrolet badge, they remember seeing one in an old movie or sitting in someone's garage, but they don't always realize how much this design influenced the future. Because the 3100 helped establish a new visual language for American pickups. The truck didn't need separate, awkward-looking components. The body could be integrated, the fenders could flow naturally, the cab could feel more like a passenger vehicle, the windshield could provide better visibility, the interior could become more comfortable, and the whole truck could feel like one coherent machine. Those ideas sound obvious today, but someone had to make them normal, and Chevrolet was one of the companies doing it. There's also something else about the 3100 that makes it fascinating: its simplicity. There are no enormous screens, no complicated electronics, no luxury features everywhere, no giant engine bay packed with technology. It's just a straightforward machine: engine, cab, frame, bed, wheels, and a design that does exactly what it needs to do. That simplicity is part of the reason people still love these trucks. They're easy to understand. They look honest. They don't pretend to be something they're not. This is a pickup, and it's proud of it. But at the same time, Chevrolet was quietly turning the pickup into something more desirable. The 3100 could be a farm truck, a delivery truck, a business vehicle, a construction truck, or simply someone's personal vehicle. That versatility was incredibly important in post-war America. People were moving, businesses were growing, the country was building roads, houses, factories, and suburbs, and trucks were needed everywhere. A vehicle like the 3100 fit perfectly into that environment. It wasn't exotic, it wasn't complicated, it was useful. And sometimes the most successful vehicles are the ones that simply arrive at exactly the right moment. The 3100 did. But there's another reason this truck matters. It helped create the emotional connection Americans developed with pickups. Before this era, you could certainly love a truck, but trucks were still largely tools. The advanced design Chevrolet began moving the pickup towards something more personal. The styling mattered, the comfort mattered, the badge mattered, the way the truck looked parked outside your house mattered, and eventually that would completely transform the American pickup market. Decades later, people would buy trucks even when they didn't need the cargo capacity. They would buy them because they liked the image, because they liked the lifestyle, because they liked the way a truck made them feel. That culture didn't appear overnight. It developed gradually, and trucks like the 3100 were part of the beginning. That's why seeing one today can be surprisingly emotional. Imagine finding a 1950 3100 sitting in an old barn. The paint is faded, the chrome is worn, the tires are probably long gone. Maybe the interior is covered in dust, but the silhouette is still unmistakable. You immediately know what you're looking at. And that's remarkable. After more than 70 years, the design still communicates exactly what Chevrolet intended: a tough but attractive American pickup. Simple, useful, confident. And perhaps that's the greatest proof of its influence. You don't have to explain what it is, you can see it. The design survived, the idea survived, and the influence survived. But the truck also tells a larger story about America.
This was the beginning of the great post-war economic boom. Americans were building, buying, traveling, expanding, and the pickup truck became one of the tools of that expansion. The 3100 wasn't simply transporting cargo, it was helping transport the country into a new era. And that's why the question is so interesting. How did this simple work truck become one of America's most influential pickup designs? The answer is that Chevrolet didn't try to make it complicated. They simply made it better. Better proportions, better visibility, better comfort, better styling, and most importantly, they understood that a truck could be both a working machine and something people actually wanted to own. That's the idea that would eventually define the American pickup, and the 1950 Chevrolet 3100 was one of the trucks that helped prove it. So when you see one today, don't think just another old Chevy. Think about what it represents. A turning point, a truck that helped bridge the gap between the crude work vehicles of the past and the modern pickups that would eventually become America's favorite personal trucks. It wasn't the fastest, it wasn't the most luxurious, it wasn't the biggest, but it didn't need to be. It simply arrived at the right moment with the right design and the right idea. And that's why the 1950 Chevrolet 3100 became far more important than it ever looked. A simple work truck that quietly helped change the American pickup forever.
6. 1951 Dodge B3B pickup. The Dodge America almost forgot. Why did Dodge's stylish post-war pickup get buried under Ford and Chevy's success? When people talk about classic American pickups from the early 1950s, two names usually dominate the conversation: Ford and Chevrolet. But sitting quietly between them was another manufacturer building some surprisingly good trucks: Dodge. And the 1951 Dodge B3B is a perfect example of a pickup that deserved far more attention than it received. At first glance, the B3B doesn't look revolutionary. It's a traditional pickup. Rounded body, large front grille, separate fenders, simple cargo bed. But look inside the cab and you begin to understand what Dodge was trying to accomplish. This wasn't just a machine designed to haul something from one place to another. Dodge wanted its trucks to be more comfortable, more practical, and easier to live with. And that was becoming increasingly important in post-war America, because the American pickup was changing. Before World War II, most people saw trucks primarily as work equipment. You bought one because you needed it. You didn't necessarily care about comfort. You didn't expect a sophisticated interior. You certainly didn't expect to spend hours driving it just because you enjoyed it. But after the war, everything started changing. America was becoming wealthier, businesses were expanding, suburbs were growing, roads were improving, and more people were using pickups for everyday transportation. The truck was slowly becoming more than a work machine, and Dodge understood that. The B-Series was part of this transformation. The cab was designed to be more comfortable than earlier Dodge trucks. Visibility was improved. The interior was more practical. The overall truck had a more modern appearance. And the result was a truck that could work hard without making the driver feel like they were sitting inside a farm machine all day. That may sound normal now, but at the time it was an important direction, and Dodge had to compete against some very serious rivals. Ford had the F-Series, Chevrolet had the advanced design trucks. Both companies had enormous dealer networks, both had strong reputations, and both were becoming deeply connected to American truck culture. Dodge had to fight for attention, and that's where the story of the B3B becomes interesting, because the truck itself wasn't the problem. The problem was visibility. Ford and Chevrolet were simply louder. Their names were everywhere. Their trucks were everywhere. Their marketing was everywhere. And when you're competing against two giants, being good isn't always enough. You have to be remembered.
Dodge struggled with that. And today, the consequences are obvious. Say 1951 Ford pickup, and most classic car fans immediately have an image in their heads. Say 1951 Chevrolet pickup, and the same thing happens. But say 1951 Dodge B3B. Suddenly, many people have no idea what you're talking about. And that's exactly what makes it perfect for a forgotten truck story. Because this was a real competitor, a serious American pickup, a truck built during one of the most important periods in the development of the modern pickup, yet it ended up living in the shadow of Ford and Chevrolet. Imagine being a Dodge buyer in 1951. You walk into a dealership, you see the new B3B. The truck looks modern, the cab is comfortable, the styling is attractive, it's capable of doing real work, and Dodge is telling you, you don't have to buy Ford. That was the challenge, because Ford and Chevrolet had already built enormous customer loyalty. A farmer who had used Ford trucks for years might simply buy another Ford. A business owner who trusted Chevrolet might stay with Chevrolet. Dodge had to convince people to switch, and that's incredibly difficult, especially in the pickup market, because truck buyers tend to be loyal. If a brand has served your family or business for years, why change? That loyalty would become one of Dodge's biggest obstacles. But the B3B deserves more credit than history usually gives it. The truck represented Dodge's understanding of what the post-war pickup was becoming. Comfort mattered, styling mattered, ease of use mattered. A truck wasn't just about payload anymore. It was also about the person behind the wheel, and that shift would eventually transform the entire industry. Think about modern pickups today. They're enormous, they're comfortable, they're loaded with technology. They're often used as daily transportation. Some owners rarely put anything in the bed. That would have seemed strange decades ago, but the foundation of that transformation was already being built in the 1940s and 1950s, and trucks like the B3B were part of it. That's why it's interesting to look at the 1951 Dodge today. It's not just a forgotten Dodge, it's a snapshot of a company trying to find its place in a rapidly changing American truck market. And there's something almost frustrating about it, because the truck looks good, it makes sense, it has the right proportions, it has the right era styling, it has the right post-war character, yet it never became the icon that Ford and Chevrolet trucks became. And that raises a bigger question. Was Dodge simply too late? Not necessarily. The B-Series arrived at a good time. America wanted trucks. The economy was growing. Demand was strong. Dodge had the technology. It had the manufacturing capability. It had a recognizable name. But Ford and Chevrolet had something incredibly valuable: momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop. Once one truck becomes popular, people start seeing it everywhere. Then more people buy it because everyone else has one. Dealers stock more of them. Parts become easier to find. Used trucks become easier to buy. And the cycle continues. That's how a truck becomes an icon. Dodge had to break into that cycle, and it never quite achieved the same cultural dominance. So decades later, the B3B became one of those trucks that classic car fans might recognize only after seeing the badge. And that's unfortunate, because the B3B represents a fascinating moment in American automotive history, a moment when manufacturers were competing to redefine the pickup. Ford was pushing the F-Series, Chevrolet was building the advanced design line, Dodge was developing its own answer, and the customer was becoming more demanding. They wanted strength, but they also wanted comfort. They wanted reliability, but they also wanted style. The American pickup was becoming a personal vehicle, and Dodge was trying to keep up. Now imagine finding one today, a 1951 Dodge B3B sitting in an old garage. Maybe the paint is faded, the chrome is dull, the tires are cracked, but the body is still intact. You look at it and realize this was once Dodge's answer to Ford and Chevrolet. It was competing for the same customers, it was fighting for the same market, and it was part of the same post-war revolution. Yet today, it's almost invisible compared with its rivals. That's the irony. The B3B wasn't forgotten because it was terrible. It was forgotten because two other brands became legends. Ford and Chevrolet dominated the conversation. Dodge got pushed into the background. And sometimes that's all it takes for a genuinely interesting vehicle to disappear from popular memory. So the real mystery isn't, was the Dodge B3B a good pickup? It was. The bigger mystery is, why didn't people remember it? Because in the early 1950s, Dodge was fighting for the same American pickup buyer as Ford and Chevrolet. But Ford and Chevrolet had something Dodge couldn't easily manufacture: a place in the American imagination. And once that happened, the B3B slowly became a forgotten chapter. But if you're looking for trucks that tell the story of how America's pickup market really developed, this Dodge deserves a place on the list. Because not every important truck became famous. Some simply disappeared behind the giants. And the 1951 Dodge B3B is one of those. A stylish post-war pickup that didn't lose because it was bad. It lost because Ford and Chevrolet were simply too big to ignore.
7. 1954 GMC 100 pickup. The GMC America forgot. Why do collectors remember the Chevrolet version but almost forget the GMC? When you look at the 1954 GMC 100, it doesn't immediately look like a forgotten truck. In fact, it looks surprisingly familiar. The rounded body, the wide grille, the smooth fenders, the classic 1950s proportions. At first glance, you might even mistake it for a Chevrolet. And that's exactly where the story gets interesting, because GMC and Chevrolet were closely connected inside General Motors. Yet GMC was trying to establish its own identity, and the 1954 GMC 100 was part of that effort. This was a straightforward half-ton pickup. It wasn't designed to shock people. It wasn't a futuristic experiment. It wasn't a muscle truck. It was built to work. But sometimes the most important trucks aren't the strange ones. They're the trucks that quietly define an entire generation, and the GMC 100 was one of those trucks. By 1954, the American pickup market was changing rapidly. The war was over. The economy was booming. Americans were buying homes, building businesses, and moving into growing suburbs, and the pickup truck was becoming increasingly important. But buyers were demanding more. They wanted a truck that could handle real work while also being comfortable enough for everyday driving. GMC understood that. The GMC 100 combined traditional truck capability with a much more refined appearance than the work trucks of the pre-war era. The cab was rounded, the windshield was large, the body lines were smooth. The front end had a strong GMC identity. And compared with older trucks, the whole thing looked much more civilized. This wasn't just a farm machine anymore. It could be a business vehicle, a delivery truck, a contractor's truck, or even someone's everyday transportation. That was the direction the American pickup was moving, and GMC was right there. But there was one enormous problem: Chevrolet. Because if you know General Motors, you know how closely these two brands were connected. GMC and Chevrolet shared a huge amount of engineering and technology. Their trucks could look remarkably similar. And for an average buyer, that created an obvious question: why buy the GMC instead of the Chevrolet? That question would become extremely important. Chevrolet had an enormous advantage. Its name was already deeply established with ordinary American consumers. People knew Chevrolet. They trusted Chevrolet. Chevrolet dealerships were everywhere, and the company's trucks were becoming extremely popular. GMC, meanwhile, was increasingly associated with professional and commercial buyers. Its identity leaned more toward the serious truck market. That gave GMC credibility, but it also meant that Chevrolet often got more attention from the average consumer. And history remembers what gets attention. That's why the 1954 GMC 100 is so fascinating. It wasn't necessarily worse than its Chevrolet counterpart. In many ways, it was a very capable truck. But Chevrolet became the cultural icon. GMC became the shadow. And that's a difficult position for any vehicle to escape.
Imagine two trucks sitting next to each other at a dealership. One carries the Chevrolet badge, the other carries GMC. They share many of the same basic mechanical ideas. They belong to the same automotive family, but one name has a much stronger connection to American consumer culture. Which one do you think the average buyer remembers decades later? Exactly, the Chevrolet. And that is how a truck can disappear from history without actually being unsuccessful. The GMC 100 didn't need to fail. It simply needed to be overshadowed, and it was. But there's another reason the 1954 model is interesting. It represents GMC at a time when the company was still trying to establish what kind of truck brand it wanted to be. Was GMC going to be simply another Chevrolet with a different badge? Or could it become something distinct? The answer would evolve over time. GMC increasingly developed its own styling cues and marketing identity. The brand became associated with trucks that were slightly more professional and heavy-duty, and that identity still exists today. But back in the 1950s, the boundaries weren't nearly as clear. The GMC 100 was part of that transition. It's a truck from an era when GMC was still defining itself, and that's why the badge matters. Look closely at the grille. Look at the emblems. Look at the details. Those small differences were important. They were GMC saying, "We're not just Chevrolet." But convincing buyers of that was another story. Because American truck buyers were already loyal. Ford had the F-Series, Chevrolet had the advanced design trucks, Dodge had its B-Series, International had its own loyal customers. GMC had to fight for space, and unlike Ford or Chevrolet, GMC had to explain why it deserved a separate place in the market. That's a difficult marketing problem, especially when customers could walk into a GM dealership and see two trucks that looked remarkably similar. But the GMC 100 still had something going for it: reputation. GMC had a long history of building commercial trucks. For people who needed a serious work vehicle, the GMC badge carried weight. It suggested durability, professional use, hard work. That mattered to farmers, contractors, and businesses, and that's why many GMC trucks survived as working vehicles for years. But ironically, that same usefulness may have contributed to their disappearance. A truck that works hard gets used hard. It gets driven, loaded, repaired, modified. Eventually, it gets replaced. The owner doesn't necessarily think, "I should preserve this because collectors will want it in 70 years. They think, "I need a truck that works." And when the truck gets too old, it's gone. That's why surviving examples of early GMC pickups can be so fascinating. They weren't necessarily protected, they had to survive, and every survivor tells a story. Imagine discovering a 1954 GMC 100 today. Maybe it's sitting behind an old workshop. The paint is faded, the body has some rust, the interior is worn, but the GMC badge is still there. And suddenly you realize how unusual it is, because most people would expect to see a Chevrolet from this era. A GMC is much less common in people's memories. And that's the irony. The Chevrolet version became a classic. The GMC version became a forgotten relative. But both belong to the same important period in American truck history. A period when the pickup was becoming more stylish, more comfortable, more personal, and more important to everyday American life. The GMC 100 helped make that transition possible. It wasn't revolutionary. It didn't need to be. It simply represented GMC's attempt to build a modern, attractive, capable half-ton pickup. And it did exactly that. But automotive history isn't always fair. The most famous vehicle isn't always the most interesting. Sometimes the forgotten version tells you more about the industry than the famous one. Because the GMC 100 shows us something important. Even inside the same company, brands were fighting for attention. Chevrolet wanted the consumer. GMC wanted the serious truck buyer. Both were competing for American roads, and both were trying to convince customers that their badge meant something. Eventually, Chevrolet won the memory battle. Today, collectors immediately recognize the classic Chevrolet pickups from this era. But the GMC 100, you might have to stop and ask, wait, what exactly is this? And that's what makes it perfect for this list. Because the truck isn't forgotten because it was insignificant, it's forgotten because it existed in the shadow of a much more famous relative. So the real mystery becomes, why do collectors remember the Chevrolet version but almost forget the GMC? Maybe because Chevrolet had the stronger consumer identity. Maybe because GMC focused more heavily on professional trucks. Or maybe because when two vehicles are almost equally important, history usually remembers only one. But if you ever see a surviving 1954 GMC 100, don't walk past it. Take a closer look. Because you're looking at a truck from one of the most important periods in American truck history. A truck that helped GMC build its own identity. A truck that worked alongside the Chevrolet and Ford icons. And a truck that deserves to be remembered for what it actually was. Not a Chevrolet copy, but one of GMC's own steps toward becoming an American truck legend.